You like your Macintosh. You like your Macintosh. Your Macintosh.
Apple. And the Macintosh, of all the machines I've ever seen, is the only one that meets that standard.
iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
If today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today?
Here in front of the Hickory Pit, the original Hickory Pit, with free slice of pie if you order something to eat. We're in Campbell, California, not so far away from Cupertino, by the way. And we're going to interview Steve Wozniak, none other than Woz, the magical Woz, the one who built the Apple I, the Apple II. And we're going to ask him some question about the G5 conference, about the Apple II, about the Mac, about a lot of other things like programming, hardware, software, Apple, a lot of things. So let's get into it and let's go and see Woz.
Those were the greatest, most fun times, and thank God my parents didn't say, Steve, you have such incredible college test entrance exam scores, you should go to these, fine, you should have this path in life. My parents just said, pretty much, let him find his own, and we'll be happy with it, and I'm so thankful for that. Yeah, that's so I don't try to pretend I got the plans for my own kids either.
Yeah. So would you think they kind of felt already that you will make something good out of your life without obliging you to do something?
You know, I was so advanced in electronics that I never had a worry in my own head about where would I ever get a job if I needed a job? What will I do in life? Where am I going? I didn't really have those kind of fears, and that gave me a lot of confidence, and I think my parents recognized that Steve will somehow always get by. He'll either wind up rich or he'll wind up in jail. That's what they always said.
Mm-hmm. So, was HP actually one of the only companies to go at that time when you was such an engineer genius?
One of the only companies to go to. No, there were tons of companies around here. As a matter of fact, when I worked for a year, I just walked in a door of a company, filled out an application. I could talk to anybody or take any test, and I would always pass so well. Yeah. I knew everything electronics and computers, so I got a job programming for a year. When I finished a year at Berkeley, my third year of college, I just looked in the newspaper, found a company, went down, took a technician test, was hired instantly, had enough of a salary I could move out from my parents. I got an apartment. What a time in your life. What a great time. And 6 months later, I got brought into Hewlett-Packard. They had heard I was a great designer. And so that they interviewed me one person after another. They gave me some technical questions and hired me right away, even without a college degree. Mm-hmm. And I felt it was so good. You can be an engineer, and you don't have to have certifications like civil engineers or doctors or that sort of thing. Yeah. You can study just as hard your whole life and know as much little detail, but you can get hired because you are a good engineer. I lived in Sunnyvale. This one was just about across the road in Cupertino. We were very close to Cupertino, extremely nearby. And you're right, that's where I started Dial-A-Joke.
Yeah. Which is very important for you.
It's so important. I could never tell you because I had believed in humor my whole life. And when I was at Berkeley, we had these blue boxes, these little devices that put tones into a telephone and made calls all over the world. And I discovered that some countries of the world had Dial-A-Jokes. And a few cities in the United States, like Los Angeles, had some Dial-A-Jokes. You could call up and hear a joke. And we didn't have any in the Bay Area. And the reason is it was illegal at that time to own, purchase, or use a telephone in the United States. It was illegal in the United States to own, purchase, or use an answering machine. You had to lease the one answering machine provided by the local monopoly, AT&T. You could lease the one that they had. So, of course, everybody got the same black phone. If you wanted an answering machine, it cost as much as my apartment rental. You know, your rental is one of the most expensive things in your life. How could you afford this? Well, I wanted to do it so badly that I paid the money, and I ran Dial-A-Joke, even though nobody else could afford to do it. I mean, would do it. I'm glad I was the first. Jeff Raskin, who was so creative and so humanist. I liked Burl Smith, who never went to college. The brightest designer. He learned to do all the little design tricks. He studied my designs, and he learned how to be another Woz. And he was totally as good as I was at designing with few parts. And Andy Hertzfeld, that I had so many conversations with, whether it be about Bob Dylan or code and all these things. He was a great software writer, and he'd gone to Berkeley, and he'd been part of this Apple Club, the enthusiast background when he got in. He was writing the software. And Bill Atkinson, the artist in Apple, that every line of code mattered so much that it be done exactly right. And Bill was the artist type, the same artistry that I had in me when I was writing code was in Bill. And these were the greatest people in the world, and they were all in the Macintosh. So I moved over there, and I was starting to design a CPU based on some bit slices, and I think it was a very bad approach. And thankfully, the 68000 came out from Motorola. It was such a good microprocessor, that was our choice. So I was relieved, but then I had a plane crash.
Yeah, okay, and it changed a lot of things. Like you stayed away from Apple for like 2 years, but it's the good point about that is that you started doing those US festivals, right?
Well, when I was in Apple before the plane crash, I was starting to think, this company has so many bright engineers now, and management, and the way management works, the one engineer, the style that I have, doesn't really have a critical place. I'm not going to make or break the company unless I come up with a really unusual idea again. And I was thinking, gosh, they don't really need me. I don't know that this is the sort of role I want to be in, this kind of company. I like the small little startup with 10 people or 5 people just talking ideas. And then after the plane crash, it was 5 weeks I was in amnesia, didn't realize I was missing time at work. So I came out of amnesia one night, and all of a sudden, first thing that popped in my head was after all the excitement of amnesia, I said, I'm going back to college for my degree. It'd been 10 years, and this was the last chance I was going to have in my life to earn it, and I was only 1 year away. So, of course, that's a strong incentive to actually say you graduated from college. Meant a lot to me. It's like you worked long and hard on a project, and you didn't quite finish it. That's something you want to finish. Well, after I put on, I went to school and I put on a couple of big music festivals with 1 million people per day called the US Festivals. And probably not supposed to say this, but we got an US Festival approved that's going to go on next May.
Oh yeah.
Another one.
I was about to ask about that. I read that you are about to start another one.
This is for real. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and we haven't announced any details yet, so I don't want to spoil the party. But then I went back to Apple, and I wanted to go back in the most productive position I could. I went back as an engineer to work on Apple II type products. And John Sculley joined immediately and got rid of the Apple III, which had sidetracked the company for 3 years. And we went back to reinventing the Apple II with the Apple II GS model computer. And it was during that time frame that I thought up the idea for, I was sort of free in a way. I couldn't quite do engineering because the public, the world of the press and the computer clubs and the whole world, somehow were fans of mine, and I was constantly getting phone calls. They came right to my desk. I didn't even have a secretary intercept my phone calls because I believed in being direct. You should be reachable in life was one of my philosophies. And I was so busy with all this press and traveling to clubs to speak to them that I didn't have time to be an engineer anymore. And I came up with the idea for remote control and thought, what a neat thing. Let's start a company and build this product that doesn't exist, that there's a use for.
Okay. And the US festivals are really important because I read somewhere that your biggest accomplishment are first your children's and then the US festivals and then, but the Apple II comes after the US festivals.
Sometimes in my thinking, I am so glad to have done the US Festival that nobody else could have done that. But right now I go back. Your viewpoints change over time. The Apple II was the most important thing I did. And when they ask about what product did you have the best feeling about that you ever designed, I have so many ideas about the floppy disk being the best single one, but I still have to go back to the Apple II when I look at it. How did I come up with so many great ideas that were just so ahead of their time and made it such a great product? So it's the Apple II is number one. Well, the children. Having a child was the biggest thing in my life,
Of course. One of the practical question would be if you use a lot the terminal in macOS 10, because you could start the terminal and start being a geek, or if you use all those graphical user interface things like Activity Monitor.
My love in life is the person that I was when I was young, and that's the person who uses the terminal. I have started to use it a little bit and then learn a few commands. I have bought books on them and haven't had time to get through it all. So I don't use the terminal on a day-to-day basis, but I wish I did. Those are the people that are going to change the world in the future, the ones that are doing that. They're the ones that I was when I grew up. But right now, I'm pretty much just a computer user, not much ahead of my mother.
Okay, which is nice for your mother.
I know, and she can't even use a computer. I got her web TV to be safe.
Mine cannot also, so...
it's a Microsoft product.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I remember another interview where you explained, it was an interview in England. There was some kind of exposition about the games or whatever in London a few months ago, where you explained how the computer games a few years ago, well, more than a few years ago, were all based on the hardware, programming the hardware, and now it turned out to be everything on the software. How do you see this change of everything being on the hardware turning to everything being on the software today?
No. I think back then, in the early days, we had limited hardware, and you had to write the software to move the bits around. Okay. Nowadays, you buy hardware chips that you can insert sprites and have to tell the sprites where to appear on the screen. So the hardware is doing the large job of moving the bits around in memory, what you see on the screen. So it's the other way around, yeah. But it was so neat back then to see every evolution. The newest computer game would be smoother and better than ever before, and to see what tricks the programmer had used, right down to the machine language, ones and zeros, to see what they had done to make the processor seem faster than it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was just great to see the level that games were going to get to. On the Apple II, as a basic starting machine, the games should not have been able to get as sophisticated as they did. Yeah. Just always impressed me. Yeah.
Let's get back to this D5 conference. You watched the video with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates?
Yeah, that's a funny conference because I was invited, very specially by Tim O'Reilly, over and over. And every time I could have gone, but I'm traveling so much and doing so much, I just need some things I can skip once in a while. And I kept emailing him excuses why I couldn't come. I had a conflict. I was lying. And I think he wasn't getting my email. He said, I never got your email on the last day, so I canceled it. He was going to give me a free attendance. Okay. This is like, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000 to attend. He was going to give it to me for free, just to attend, and it would have been so easy. And then when I watched the videos, I wished I'd been there. That one video of Jobs and Gates was the most incredible, to see people in their normal sense. And I've always seen Bill Gates come across like a very normal person. But Steve Jobs is usually a little bit too prepared and careful and everything, but he was such a natural person that show. Just, I wished I'd been there.
That's the reason why I ask you. I also wished you've been there. The reason being is that they kept on coming back to you in the conversation about was did that.
You mentioned that movie Pirates of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Those early days of how did kids, a couple of kids in their young 20s, a couple of kids with no money, no business experience, no business schooling, no business courses. How did they do this? And that's what people really want to get back to. And even it's close to me and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and not only that, every single person that was in the Homebrew Computer Club when all this stuff was happening in the earliest days of Apple. And Gates, would go back to 74 and 75. Those steps that were taken back then were so important and so critical. And I know that Gates admires what I did. I've had personal conversations along those lines, and the way Steve speaks about it, he says the best things about me anyone ever says. And I wish I'd been there so I could have filled in a couple details. Why didn't Woz do a floating point basic? And he sort of said, I really don't have the answer.
So what's the answer?
When I sat down to write a basic, I had never taken a course in writing a computer language. Okay, I had thought about it in my head, and I had seen Xerox copies of a book of a friend of mine who went to MIT, so I consider myself to have an MIT education. So I knew some starting points. I wrote down a full syntax diagram of my basic, having never programmed BASIC in my life. I opened up a Hewlett-Packard manual and copied their syntax. I didn't realize it was different than what Gates had used from Digital Equipment BASIC. And I put out syntax diagrams for everything, including floating point. I know numbers. Numbers is my mathematics, is my thing in life. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'll be the first one to write a basic for the 6502. My name will get famous like Bill Gates. This is back in the days when we were unknown. Bill Gates was just a young little 20-year-old college kid who'd written a basic, and we knew his name in our club. And his name was in magazines. He had written a basic. I'll get that famous, I thought. So I'll write it fast, but if I take out the floating point, I'll get done a month sooner. So I stripped the floating point out of my syntax diagram and started writing my basic. And when I was done, Steve sort of indicated this. It was handwritten. And being handwritten, you couldn't just type in some extra stuff and have everything expand to fit. It would have been very hard for me to add the floating point back in. And I didn't care. This basic did what I needed, which was to play games and solve my circuit simulations at Hewlett-Packard. So I wrote it initially with only integers, no numbers with decimal points, no floating point. And then I started working in the lab with Randy Wigington, a young programmer that helped me do the floppy disk later. And we were working, defining our version of a floating point basic we were going to write. We were passing it around the company. And Microsoft came in the door and said, we've got one for you to try. Yeah. So maybe Steve Jobs had gone out and gotten them to write it. Maybe they just came up with one on their own. They brought theirs in, and I said, well, they could add these commands and this command and this command. And I guess somebody came down. Bill Gates talked like he came down himself and worked with me. But I just basically supplied the code for some routines to draw color lines and a few things that our Apple II could do well, and to access all of our slots for printout devices and keyboard devices like floppy disks even. And I got those commands into their BASIC, and I said, wow, that saves us the time. Why do our own BASIC? I can move on to much more important tasks like a floppy disk.
Yeah. So that's a really cool thing.
So really, it didn't get done because I was working on it, and we got beat.
Yeah.
Microsoft popped one in the door.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny, by the way. In this conference, when Steve Jobs said everybody was asking was, and then the guy asked, who was everybody? Well, I.
Asking me about what? I forget.
Asking about the floating point.
About the floating point. Yes, Steve
He
Jobs
was putting pressure on you about the floating point or not?
Actually, the pressure, I think, came more from Mike Markkula. Mike Markkula had conceived a checkbook program. Randy or some of the young people and Mike Markkula himself wrote it in our BASIC. And the checkbook...
Mike Markkula was technical?
And they wrote it, yes, he was technical. Very quite. And so was Mike Scott. We all were. And they wrote, and they loved learning that you could have a machine you could program. This Apple II was just wonderful to all of us. But Mike Markkula had written a checkbook program with Randy Wigington using integers only, but simulating the decimal points that you needed for numbers, which is fine with me. That's the way I would do it. But he really wanted to have those floating point numbers in a variable. A equals 3.25 for $3.25. And I think he was the real push, but it was really coming from he and Steve Jobs. We need a floating point BASIC. That was one of our two hot projects at the time. Floating point BASIC and floppy disk were, I think, at the top of the chart, but I don't know. I was working on it, but Microsoft came in so soon. I said, why do this perfect ultimate BASIC when we just got one sitting here that we can buy? Yeah. And then there's lots of things. In those days, anything you did for this new computer was going to have a market and sell and make it better and be useful to people. Anything. If it was just making a new printer work, making a modem work, making a serial driver work, it was those cards had to get designed.
Okay. Yeah. Well, a lot of people, if not all the people in the Mac community, have a lot of respect for yourself and for Steve Jobs, but a lot of people also disrespect Bill Gates. Could you tell them, please, that Bill Gates is also in his style a genius, and that is really important for the industry? Because I think that's what your opinion, and that's also mine.
Well, a lot of people disregard certain things about Steve Jobs, too.
Yeah.
And over time, there's this idea that Bill Gates just was in it for the money and didn't want to make the great products. And I never, ever looked at it that way, ever. I never once disdained him. I actually thought he comes across honest on stage, and honesty to me is number one to judging a person. Yeah. And, pretty much he came from starting where I did. Starting writing a BASIC. He wrote a BASIC. Sure, he became a businessman instead to continue things going, to bring it to the world. But he was technical, and you had to be pure to drop out of college, just to write a BASIC for these little new hobby computers that weren't even computers. His BASIC would make them a computer. Maybe it was one of the elements that could make them a computer. So I admired him for that, and I also admire him even when they had a command line structure, the old type of operating system at Microsoft, and we had the new Macintosh, the GUI operating system, and we're called a toy. I still think that Microsoft was making the better business decisions, that a company shouldn't get into a technology until it's the right time affordably. How much does it cost to provide something? And the Macintosh tiny reduced screen, we've gone to black and white. Look at our logo was 6 colors for a reason. We were the color company, and now the PCs were color, and the Apples were turning black and white. And it was such a tiny screen, all these sacrifices to get the cost down to something that was still an extremely high cost. We should have thought about it and sat on it and waited to make it a mainstream project until it was so affordable. We could have done a much better product from day one. We had to do a lot of scrambling. I think we set the world back by taking shortcuts to save cost that later were very painful to undo, and add the right things to make it a computer by the sense of where computer science was even 20, 30 years before we did the Apple. I mean, early days of computers, they had things like, multiple programs running at once. How do they protect themselves from each other? These sort of concepts, memory mapping, just none of that was in the early Macintosh, and I wish it had been. I think it was a rush to jump out too soon. And then once we had the product, even when it was dying, we had to figure out a way to make it successful. And it took quite a few years for the Macintosh to even overtake the ancient Apple II in sales.
Yeah. Well, and at the beginning, it was still driving the business at Apple, the Apple II, in terms of money.
Yeah, as long as the money was pouring in, nobody could notice all of the travails inside trying to get the company on some new track. Nobody noticed all the things going wrong or problems. The Apple III, I mean, the outside world would have no idea. The Apple II was the largest selling computer in the world from 80 to 83, that every engineer and everybody at Apple had to have an Apple III on their desk. It was forced on by the company. The Apple III is our product. The Apple II is going away. And they were just dead wrong, and it was just horrible.
Yeah. I started my computer career when I was 11 with a Commodore 64. Like a lot of my people, I think it could be that it's much more in Europe. How important was the Commodore 64 at those time? Because for me, it's really important.
The Commodore PET missed the mark a lot. The Commodore 64, and along with the Atari machines, were real good, viable machines, and they were great. They were low cost compared to the Apple. The Apple was a little bit better in almost every way you'd ever look at, memory and amount of colors and whatever. But the Commodore 64 was, anybody who started with that's where we all started. Yeah. Older people than yourselves tell me how they started with the Apple II, and it was one of the most important things in your life. That Commodore must have got you to where you are as far as understanding computers and liking them and deciding, wow, it's going to be a part of my life forever. You must have made that decision internally, even without speaking it.
I started working with the Commodore 64 and playing with it because it was more a playing machine than a working machine. But one day I discovered, there is a BASIC over there. And then I started programming. And I always say, I stopped playing when I started programming.
Yeah, I think that's so fun to discover, and I don't know why Apple doesn't push I wish we shipped a BASIC kind of built into the machine in ROM. It's nice to turn a machine on, beep, and you're running a BASIC. Yeah. That's how it was back before floppy disk. Even with floppy disk on the Apple II, that's how it was. But we have AppleScript built in. That's a programming language. Yeah. And I wish Apple just gave a few examples, because young kids I found in my classes in 5th grade, once they learn how to type a couple of AppleScript commands and vary them around, it's like controlling the machine with remote control, and that's what programming's all about. And that's how you find out if that's in your heart, if that's a thing you want to do in your life.
I don't know if you think this, but I think the learning curve today for some things like Cocoa and all those things is too hard for the beginning. I wish, everybody criticized Visual Basic, but Visual Basic is incredibly great because it's so simple, and then it gets you to things like C.
Yes. Two things you want. You want the simple language, and maybe it doesn't follow certain structures that very advanced computer people can think out. Well, you know what? You need starting languages. In your life, to be a programmer, you need a starting point. And when you start with those professional, complicated, high learning curve languages, it can turn you off, make life difficult forever and not enjoyable. Yeah. And you miss that enjoyable stage of something like Visual Basic, where you can write a bunch of puzzle solvers and games. And I always like a language that you can be, as you write a few lines of code, you can see something happen on the screen. I need the feedback more than most programmers do. And I want to write a few things and see a feedback that tells me, aha, this is what I did. I need visual stuff. And that's one of the nice things about, we had a language called HyperTalk that was that way, Visual Basics that way, and a few other languages. Even the scripting languages are very much like that, because they make something happen right away that you recognize, whether it's telling another program to do something or what.
Yeah. So you started Apple Computer, and now it's called Apple Inc. Steve Jobs said they are not in the hardware business, but in the software business. What do you think about that declaration?
Oh, I don't think that's what he said. I think that's a misinterpretation. Steve Jobs, long ago, realized that the difference in machines was really in their software. The software is what you see and feel, not the hardware. The hardware can be made beautiful or ugly, but software is what you're playing with. And what was the question?
So what do you think about the dropping the computer name and saying you're in the software business?
The name dropping just sort of signified to me, well, Apple, for all time, had been pretty much a one-product company. Yeah. A line of computers and things around it. And now all of a sudden, the iPod was so huge, and gosh, was it huge, and it reached that whole world. I think then Steve Jobs really saw that, reaching the whole world in market share is an awful lot. Even with a cheap little iPod, is worth as much as the expensive Macintosh computers reaching just a few. And now we're coming out with the iPhone. Who knows what's next? We came out with an Apple TV, but maybe there's more variations along those lines. Mm-hmm. All these different products that are for everyone might be Apple's future. And why be stuck with the name? Apple Computer's longer. I like things simple, so simplify it.
Everybody calls it Apple.
And everybody calls it Apple, so it's Apple Inc. So it's just simplified, and it doesn't, Apple Computer would be okay even if we were building tables. A table from Apple Computer, wow, it's such a spectacular, great table. That's what I think. Or a bed from Apple Computer. The name computer wouldn't get in the way. Wouldn't bother you, I mean, God, what does IBM sell that's not really business machine? I mean, personal computers, you don't even think business machines. But
IBM is business.
But there are a lot of companies that have part of their name implies something that really, that's no longer really what the company makes.
Well, the thing is, still today, IBM sounds boring, whereas Apple and maybe Microsoft sounds a bit more fun. Because IBM is still a lot business-oriented.
Yeah, but you got to admire that IBM had the forethought to copy the Apple II. Their executives tell me over and over how they were just talking everywhere inside and ordering Apple IIs and studying that product. They had to get into that business, and that was so unusual for a mainframe maker to set up a division sort of secretly in Boca Raton. And they developed, and I forget, Don Etheridge was the guy behind it, but he died in an airplane crash a few years ago. To actually put together a team to build this product. That IBM saw that this was maybe a big part of the future. And I think that was so much foresight they had. I think they made a lot of mistakes, and Microsoft, boy, they just mishandled that over and over.
So when the Apple II came, there was kind of a decision of Apple to buy back all the Apple I's from everybody. Maybe you might not tell it why, but I always wondered why.
I don't know. Did we buy back 20 Apple I's or something? I mean, we did.
Or even more. Everybody was.
No, we hadn't sold many Apple I's. We'd sold maybe 100. So how do you buy? We built 200. From what I remember, we built 200, and we probably sold 175 of them.
Okay.
Some of them would go into 20 of them into a place running Star Trek computer games in Orange County. So some of them wouldn't get returned, and I don't know the number. I only think about 20 got returned for a discount on an Apple II. But the Apple I was because we didn't want to spend time supporting the Apple I, although it was not hard, there was nothing to it. But we were going to give people a machine that was sort of dead-ended, and then all of a sudden Apple Computer would have this great world going forward with the Apple II now that we had money. We had money that was put in. So why would we want our customers to feel left out? And sure, what they had was still a great machine. My Apple I could solve all my circuit simulations at Hewlett-Packard to this day. I mean, I think we even got a printer on it one time, so I could even do word processing if I wanted.
So speaking about the Apple II, and we spoke about big companies like IBM, we might speak also about big companies like Intel. Today it takes a lot of people, like thousands of people, to build a computer, whereas you build the Apple II alone. Okay, it's a different story, it's harder, but still I have the feeling we don't have anymore the kind of the technical knowledge or whatever that you had at that time.
I don't know how I built the computer alone. I admire, but if you go to a college course and you look in at a research department course in a university or even an undergraduate courses, and somebody's working on microprocessor projects, and it's their job to design together some chips hooked up to a microprocessor, some input, some output, and they've got to write the software themselves, it's generally a 1 or 2 person job. So that's the level that was needed. I just knew all the steps, which were a little larger than the average college project, all the steps needed to get a computer done, including I figured out how to write a BASIC. But you want to know something? More importantly than knowing how to is I knew I wanted a BASIC. I didn't know how to write it, but I'm going to find the way to get there. If my whole life depends on it. I don't have a computer until I have it running a language. I had to write it. When you have to, you find out everything you can, and thank God I was well educated and not a typical hacker like a lot of technicians are. And and I was just had the right skills and the right background. I mean, I sat down, I got lower, like when I was at De Anza, I know that I got something like in a math course, math analysis or something, I got a B or maybe a C+, a lousy grade in a class. But I sat there in that class the whole time with my friend Alan Baum next to me, and I was writing code in Nova, Data General Nova, mini computer assembly language, writing it on paper, to try to write the starts of something that would be a Fortran compiler. So I was trying to teach myself back in college how to write computer languages without a course.
To finish, I got some presents for you. I got 2 presents. So the first one is a nice Pomcast mug, so you can drink your coffee in this nice one.
I am so thankful for this. It's one of my favorite things to collect anywhere.
And the second one is a one for geeks. I hope you don't know this thing, and I hope you love it. It's batteries, but it's USB batteries. So
Whoa.
This is a really cool company.
So you could charge something that
Yeah.
plugs in. That has, no, this is a normal USB
This is a
plug.
normal battery.
So
and
this,
it's a
so it charges itself from your USB of your computer.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this is so great. I love it.
This is really cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Oh my gosh, 2 of them.
yeah, that's really cool.
Unbelievable. I can charge them on my computer.
That's the big thing about
and
that.
put them in my laser pointers.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Thank you for the interview, and see you soon.
Okay, thanks so much. This is really special.
Okay, cool.